So, hello everyone. Daryl Black here. Mark Smith. Very pleased that you're on board. We'll just give it a couple minutes for people to hop onto here. So, Laurence and I were just having a few laughs, a little bit off camera here around, the nature of workplaces these days and video calling and some of the times just wearing shorts when you're wearing a dress shirt and things like that. Um, so the way it is going to shake down today is, well, first of all, I'm giddy with excitement for the guest that we're about to talk to. So we'll go through the kind of the more formal interview process or part of the discussion, and then at the end, if there's time, we'll have a question and answer opportunity. So I'll just ask, if you have questions, just put a Q uh, to start, and then that way in the comments, and then type out your question. Then I'll have the ability to kind of scan through it and see where we go with that. So just a couple of announcements first and foremost. One of which is, if you haven't registered for the summit, it's 11, well, it's 12 speakers, including myself. So I'd highly encourage you to head there and register. It's fantastic. It's got some great speakers, gentlemen that, Chicago Fire Department, 30 plus years, Tom Miner, 9 hurricanes, World Trade Center, Pentagon, all of those types of things. So I'd encourage you to give that a shot. And also, of course, this is a live stream that will be edited and then released as a podcast episode in Lead from the Inside Out. So I encourage you to find that. And also, resources. I've put together a whole whack of resources for you. If you go to that page, I'll just show it again. All these links are in the description as well, by the way. So, all right. So I am really excited to be speaking to Laurence Gonzalez, and I'll be turning it over to him shortly. But when you have the opportunity to speak to somebody that produced a book or a body of work that has, and I mean this literally, that has truly shaped how I interact with others, how I facilitate programs. I know that a lot of my U.S. partner, for example, Mission Centered Solutions, so shout out to them, use Laurence's work as a basis for what we call human factors. And so, Laurence, first of all, thank you for agreeing to talk with us today. And instead of me going into a long diatribe, because that will take an hour and 15 in itself, just can you maybe give folks a little rundown of what you've been up to, like your kind of a little bit of your background and how you ended up writing 50 million books, pretty much, it seems like. You're a prolific writer. So can you help us understand who is Laurence Gonzalez?
Well, to begin with, I grew up under my father, who was both a combat veteran of World War II and a scientist. He flew B 17 aircraft over Germany during the war. He was a bomber pilot and got shot down, and that plays into the whole saga that I talk about in Deep Survival and elsewhere. Um, Actually got me started thinking about survival. But he was so badly injured when he was shot down that he couldn't go on with his military career. So he was retired, went back to school, got a PhD in biophysics, and became a medical school professor. And so as a little kid, I was always pestering him like, well, what do you do? What do you do? And he would say things like, well, I do science, but it's kind of complicated. I don't know if I could explain it to you. And so I kind of thought my dad was maybe like the slow kid in school who couldn't tell what he did because the other kids could all explain what their fathers did.
Right. Because they're a mailman, they're whatever, accountant, something
Right,
like that, right?
right. But eventually I pestered him into taking me to work with him when I was probably about 8, and I started working for him. I worked in the labs, started out, washing glassware. And eventually he taught me science in the lab. So it was kind of like live science. And he was a guy who was interested in everything. And so I became infected with that kind of curiosity. If you see something, so his motto was nothing is boring. If you look at something and you say, oh, that's boring, I'm looking at a brick, how could that be interesting? Or I'm looking at a rock, what's interesting about a rock? Well, you start getting into geology and suddenly you realize you're in a whole world of amazing things. So I grew up thinking like that. And as a consequence of this cross of science and survival, I always wanted to understand accidents. Why do accidents happen? And because of the flying he did, I became a pilot. I became interested in aviation accidents. I started writing about air crashes. And the National Transportation Safety Board, which investigates these crashes, would always make their reports and they'd say, well, it was this mechanical malfunction that led to pilot error. And the guy drove his plane into the ground. And I'd say to these investigators, this guy's a really smart guy. I mean, he's got 30,000 hours experience. He's ex-military. He's got a master's in engineering. How could he make the stupidest mistake that a pilot can make and drive his plane into the ground? A smart person doing a stupid thing is always a mystery. And they'd say, well, we don't know. I mean, we'd like to tell you that, but he's dead and we can't interview him, so we don't know. And so this was the part I thought was the most interesting piece of the puzzle. It's like, why do smart people do stupid things? And that led me down this path of studying neuroscience to find out, like, what's really going on in this guy's brain when he does this dumb thing. And that is essentially what deep survival is. And so over a course of, people ask me, how long did it take you to write Deep Survival? And I say, all my life.
Yeah.
Essentially, it was the culmination of all of these years of thought, research, et cetera, et cetera. The actual typing of it only took me about 9 months. But by that time, I had figured out what I wanted to say after a very long time of incubation. So, that's kind of how we got here.
So then I'm curious. So, well, first of all, Laurence, if we're measuring books, I get that you've written 1 or 2 or 5 or 10, but I've written a book too. All right. So if we're going to start measuring books, let's drop this right now. All right. And mine is a bestseller. It has sold as best as it could. Okay. So it's the same. Let's not talk semantics as well, but absolutely interesting origin story. And then, so how did you take that and now, extrapolate that or extend that into the work you do with Firefighter, Burn Foundation, and all of those other things? Because, that's not a normal trajectory, right? To now go on the circuit and speak. So how did you get involved into that?
So when Deep Survival first came out, I started getting calls. I was wondering who would be interested in talking to me. I started getting calls from like hedge fund managers. And Deep Survival, for people who have not read it yet, is a book about decision making. The subhead is Who Lives, Who Dies, and Why. So it's about decision making in the sense of like, why did you do that stupid thing? And it's also about the characteristics that determine who lives after doing the stupid thing and who doesn't. And live can mean, surviving in business, or it can mean surviving an illness, or it can mean, getting off the mountain you tried to climb. But I began getting calls from people like hedge fund managers, investment bankers, people who had nothing to do with the wilderness, because I use a lot of wilderness examples in Deep Survival. They weren't interested in the wilderness. They were interested in decision making, and especially decision making where there's limited information, confusing information. And that's, of course, what Deep Survival is about. So I would talk to them about how the decision-making system in our brain works, first of all, how it can systematically mislead us, and then once we've gotten into trouble, what the steps and characteristics are to get out of trouble. And so that's why, firefighters, law enforcement, military, people who are naturally in hazardous environments want to know, like, well, how do I avoid making that stupid decision that's going to kill me?
And I think it's a good jumping off point, and then we'll deep dive into some of the more specifics. But it's an important point to make with regard to, we have kind of a fallacy that firefighters, law enforcement, emergency managers, EMS, they're different, right? They make decisions differently, or physiologically they're different, neurologically they're different. Their approaches could be different, but ultimately speaking, from a physiological, neurological perspective, stress is stress. Decision-making processes are decision-making processes, and I would encourage people to, even though the context could be firefighting, or maybe it's Mount Hood and three parties ripping off the side of a mountain, or it's a rock climber, or it's a firefighter that's low crawling. It's important for us to recognize that it transcends all of that, because we're really talking about the human organism and then the human brain ultimately. So I'm curious, Laurence, one of the things that you talk about and have talked about in deep survival, and I've seen this in my own life, one of the sayings that I have is navigate from where you are, not from where you wish you were. So can you speak to that? Because that is a critical tenet for, just trying to figure out where you're at, just trying to get your bearings and moving forward. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, so in deep survival, there's an appendix, and the appendix contains traits of survivors, um, things that I singled out from taking many, many cases and saying what's in common of these cases. And the very first thing most people do in an emergency is they deny it. They say this can't be really happening. So you break your leg in on top of a mountain in Peru in snow, and you say, well, maybe it's just sprained. Um, so the first item in this list in deep survival is perceive and believe, and it means that the direct evidence of your senses is usually going to be involved in doing anything about it. So we're right now in the middle of this pandemic that was caused initially by people denying that it was happening and just dismissing it as, you know, I don't think that's really important. Um, and there's no shortage of information in this world about the fact that this pandemic was inevitable. We knew it was going to happen sometime, sooner or later. And then when it did happen, everybody said it's not happening for long enough to let it get out of control. So that's a perfect example of this process that I'm talking about. Um,
So
Go ahead.
sorry to interrupt, but why is this so difficult for people? Why is that often the first kind of step where it's that denial, or maybe it's a job layoff, or just something not going right? From your experience, why is that? It's pretty universal, I would submit.
So the way that there's a system of perception, and I give a whole talk about this to corporate people mostly, but to lots of different groups. In fact, search and rescue groups I've given this talk to. It's essentially about how our perception works to shape decision making. And when I say decision making, I'm talking about doing something. So you see, I look out my backyard and I'm sitting there reading a book in a chair and I'm comfortable, and I see a mad dog come down the alley. I perceive this, I understand it's a threat, I get up, I go inside. That's, I've made a decision by doing something. So a decision leads to an action. It doesn't have to be an intellectual thing, and mostly it's not an intellectual thing. And there's a whole range of perceive and act systems that we use. So if you have an itch, you scratch it. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to deliberate about it. And this automatic system is the rule rather than the exception in our behavior throughout our lives. We don't think of it that way. We think of ourselves as logical creatures, and indeed, we can use logic. And logic means doing something in a stepwise fashion. You go to IKEA, you buy a nightstand, it comes in a box, it's all in pieces. What do? Well, you open the instructions, and if you do each one of these steps one by one, you'll get a nightstand. Now, no other animal can do this. A chimpanzee can try for, a million years and never get it right. But we can do it because we can do logic, step by step. That's a very skimpy facility, though, and mostly we don't do that. That's not how we make decisions. So oftentimes when I give this talk, I stand up and I start by saying, Raise your hand if you've ever known someone who's made a really bad decision in a love relationship. And of course, if you're over 13, you raise your hand, right?
Right.
And and so, um, why did that person do that? Is that person stupid? No, that's not. The person did it because we do things automatically, and love is one of the most powerful of the automatic motivators we have, and we don't know why we do it. Um, but once we start accepting that that's the rule, automatic behavior without having to deliberate, we start to realize that um, it shapes our world literally, and so we're evolved to learn an environment, behave correctly for this environment, and if the environment changes, we deny it because we're already adapted to it, and because it's part of our automatic system. We're not used to thinking. I was talking to my brother yesterday. We were talking about how hard it is to think about driving when you're driving, because for most of us who are older than driver's license age, it becomes automatic very quickly. So you can be driving and talking on the phone and drinking a latte and correcting the kids in the back seat, all while missing the parked cars somehow automatically and not running people over automatically. But that can be very dangerous too, because you can miss things. Um, I saw a guy killed because a driver was driving automatically and hit a man on a scooter, because the man on the scooter wasn't part of the system this guy was imagining he was in, and appeared out of nowhere. And so we were talking about how, isn't it better if you're driving a 4,000-pound vehicle to be thinking about what you're doing so that you deliberate a little bit before doing something stupid like that, and how very, very hard it is to do that.
Mm.
So part of our perceptual system does two things. First of all, everything turns into what I call a mental model.
Mm-hmm.
We have a one-year-old granddaughter, and the first time she saw a dog, she got all excited. This is a dog, she couldn't say it, but somebody said doggy. And the next time she saw a dog, it was like, oh, doggy. And after a few times, it became obvious that she knew what dogs were in a general way. She had a generalized picture in her brain of a dog, and it didn't matter if it was a Chihuahua or a Great Dane or a Lhasa Apso. She knew it was a dog, and she was going to never, never mistake a dog for a goat or a goat for a dog or a cat. She would always know dogs because she has in her brain this idealized model of what a dog is, which I call a mental model. And then the brain gives us the ability to do things with these mental models. So we learn what I call behavioral scripts.
Mm-hmm.
We can do things like driving the car is a behavioral script. Some of the neuroscientists call these fixed action patterns.
Or habits to the layperson.
They are habits. They
Mm-hmm.
are habits. That's exactly right. And as part of the brain that's studied as habit learning, there's a whole field of neuroscience that's habit learning. And so we learn to tie our shoes. And this is a miraculous system. You try to teach, we have another grandson who's 4, try to teach him to tie his shoe. It's very frustrating. You have to go over it step by step, little tiny steps. Again, like the IKEA part of the brain that puts the nightstand together. You take these little steps and do them one by one, and you finally get the bow. But then one day, after doing it many, many times, he suddenly discovers that he knows how to tie his shoe. And something that had required all of his attention all of a sudden requires none of his attention, which is great if you're tying your shoe, not so great if you're driving a car.
Right.
But
Now,
this is
if you
the
were
rule.
able
Now,
to tie, if you were able to tie your shoe while you're driving, that would be impressive, right? But that's a whole different conversation. That would no one. And do not try that at home, folks. I just wanted to just make sure that. So now,
right.
Laurence. So before we go too much further, it was really interesting, and I wanted to. I don't want to dismiss it because even the language we use. So even in your example was a mad dog coming down the alley. It by the time it reaches cognitive or our cognition, it's already gone through that mental model and those filters, and it's important depending on what my filter was. All dogs are great, they're all friendly, or maybe I had a poor encounter with one and all dogs are bad. So even just the language we use and how quickly we need to recognize that, to your point, we're not logical thinkers, and yet a lot of people think that they are. So what I'm hearing you say then is we are creating mental models, and we're given the mental models kind of early on, but then we start to interpret and we create our own and morph them. But how quickly that we form those and how significant they have in our perception, which is the very first step in decision making. So it's really critical for people to recognize that if we don't have good, we call it situation awareness. If you don't have that, then you can make the best decision in the world, but if it's based on the wrong perception, then you're not going to be
Right.
getting the outcome that you would like, and it's a very complicated process.
And it's important to recognize too that, to take the example of the mad dog, I live in a nice quiet suburb where lots and lots of people have dogs and they're mostly friendly. And chances are, if I were sitting out there and there was a mad dog coming along, my first thought would be denial. My first thought would be, well, if somebody's dog is, it doesn't make any difference. And so the thing that you call situational awareness, and you can also call mindfulness, and you can also call just
Hmm.
pay attention to what's going on, and be attuned to changes in your environment, would give you some clues that this wasn't an ordinary dog. Um, and this is especially true in, most of us live in circumstances that never get dangerous. And probably the most dangerous thing most of us do is driving a car, actually. But if you're in a dangerous profession, such as firefighting or law enforcement, um, things are a little different for you, and that being especially aware and attuned to changes in your environment becomes vital.
And so now that's a really good segue to the conversation with regard to stress and staying calm and all of those things, because ultimately speaking, stress has a real dire impact on our ability to make decisions and communicate effectively and so on and so forth. And I want people to recognize that, like we kind of led off with, neurologically, stress is stress is stress, and our reactions to it are the same. So don't discount the stress that you're feeling when you're going into a big meeting with a VP and you're going to be doing a project. Like, that stress, that reaction is real. And even though it's
Yeah.
not a physical threat, right? It's not like the VP is physically going to, pummel you, but that stress is very much the same, those reactions. And so, can we speak to that? So, from a leadership perspective, whether it be emergency services or corporate, what happens? And I'm going to start off with a very quick story of my own, and then you can kind of insert your expertise on it. So, tornado in central Alberta, and as many as 100 people were missing and believed deceased. So we went there, search and rescue. We deployed, and I was our team leader. So I walked in. Everyone else was outside this campground that had been ripped apart by a tornado. I received my briefing. Everything's great. So I call back to our team and I say, "Yeah, come on in, and I'll brief you up." Now, Laurence, I hadn't seen the site yet. It was just up on a hill where the command posts were, and I I remember I'm like, "Oh, shit, I should probably check it out. Like, I haven't even seen the site yet." So I walked up to the edge of the crest of the hill, and physiologically, I like, my breath was taken away. Like, literally, I was frozen. So, which is very much the same kind of feeling as somebody walking onto a stage, fear of public speaking, or somebody going into a burning building, or something like that. So can you speak to what was going on with me at that particular time as I walk up to the edge of that crest of that hill and I look across, and
Yes.
what's happening there?
You've opened up a huge subject, and an important one. And so, to begin with, let's understand that we talked about reason earlier. Reason and emotion are like a seesaw. So, and by emotion, I mean stress, because that's a form of a manifestation of stress. So, if emotion is up here, reason's going to be down here. And if you can somehow bring reason back up, you can bring emotion down. Um, So that's a basic, it's an oversimplification, but it works. And when you are, there are stages to stress, and all mammals have a series of responses that basically go like social. The first thing is social. We can see this if you take your puppy to the park and there's a bigger dog there and the two of them collide, the puppy's going to roll over on its back and to signal the big dog, I'm negotiating with you. I'm exposing my neck. This is a lethal point of biting here. And it signals the big dog, then like, okay, you're the big dog, I'm the puppy, let's get over it. If that doesn't work and the big dog attacks, the second stage is fight or flight, it's struggle. So you automatically struggle to try to get away. If that doesn't work, the third stage is freezing, which is an ancient reptilian heritage that we still have in us. We have the ability to freeze. If you go back and look at the bombing that occurred at the Atlanta Olympics, I think it was 1996, there's a video where there's a big crowd of people and the bomb goes off and everybody drops, to a knee. It's like they all freeze and then they run. But freezing is a very natural response. So if you are confronted by something that's extremely high stress, chances are you'll freeze first because you've already gone through the other stages so fast. There's nothing else for you to do, and you're helpless. Essentially, it's a helpless response, and then you try to get out of that as quickly as possible. Physiologically, there's all kinds of things going on there. There's basically a fairly long explanation of there's a bundle of nerves that comes out of the base of the brain called the vagus nerves, and they wrap around your organs, and they can actually slow down your heart rate. They can make your muscles not move. And in extreme cases, they can kill you by lowering your metabolism so much that, unlike a reptile who's cold-blooded, we need a lot of oxygen and to keep things going. And so it's a very real response, and everybody's capable of it for the most part. But that's what was happening.
And so then, to tie that, our next step will be talking about how we can short circuit that if possible. But I guess then that speaks to our perception and the mental model, right? So you're looking for pattern recognition. You don't see the pattern, or at least what you're seeing doesn't fit the mental model that you had. So that signals to the brain, correct me if I'm wrong, that there's some sort of a threat, there's a change, there's something going on. And then that elicits that stress response, which could be fight, flight, or freeze. Would that be kind of a reasonable
Yeah.
kind of sequence?
Yeah, and the thing about, so we are creatures who imitate. That's how we know. I'm sure we've all had this experience. You go to visit a friend and you look at his face and you go like, what's wrong? Something happened. I can really, I can feel it that somebody died or something really bad. Your girlfriend left you or I don't know what, but we communicate this way constantly, and it's usually on a subtle, less dramatic level, but we read each other and we imitate each other. So if I go over there and my best friend is in distress, I'm going to be in distress too. And we all know this from experience. Like, let's say you're in the kitchen with your wife and you're cutting onions and she cuts the tip of her finger off. You're going to go, like this, and you're going to feel it. And so we all feel each other's states. If you see somebody injured, you're going to have the same reaction. So people who are first responders, firefighters, that sort of thing, you get a lot of trauma in your work because you're seeing people hurt, and it's innate in your emotional system to respond as if you're being hurt. And so this is part of, when you saw that scene, it was so shocking because you internalized it right away. And there's no getting around that except training and experience. And even that doesn't get you around it. It just allows you to act. And you may wind up, if you act enough and you're of a certain kind of makeup, you may wind up with PTSD as a result of it. But this is an inherent part of doing this kind of work. And the only way to deal with it is to train and gain experience.
And so with that, and it's interesting you should say that because I've defined that having been on hundreds of missions, Katrina, Rita, you know, Canada's two largest disasters, list goes on, and I do recognize that somewhere during each incident, and I was a project manager for 10 years, so it was the same even walking into that, you know, VP meeting. I recognize that there is that moment where it is that sense of overwhelm, but to your point, what I've learned just through experience and training is how to overcome that. So I think it's important to recognize that don't beat yourself up for feeling that way, right? Like that is a normal physiological, neurological reaction. That's just part of our DNA. And whereas a lot of people are like, ah, you know what? I'm fearless. I'm fearless. Well, I think I'll call bullshit on that because there's no such thing, in my opinion. It's about being courageous, seeing the fear and
Well,
acting in spite of it. So
if you're
that,
not afraid, you don't appreciate the severity of the situation you're in. But just to make the link to the corporate meeting that you referenced, so why is that stressful? Why should you be stressed out by that? Because there's no threat, really, is there? Well, yes, there is, because one of the essentials of our type of creature, in addition to mimicking each other and reading each other's emotions, is that we must be part of the group. It's an essential survival matter. If you're out of the group, you're basically dead. You can't survive without the group. And this is embedded in our evolutionary history. You know, today in a modern world, you could survive without the group, but in a sense, not really. If you're in a corporate setting and you're employed there and you're making a pitch to the boss, you could be out of the group suddenly, out of a job, certainly. And so it's a very gut wrenching thing to think you're risking your status in the group. Um, and it's a survival matter. So you're going to feel the same way as if you're facing some kind of physical danger.
you know, and then that feeds into our innate sense of am I enough, which is kind of one of those basic human conditions that we all suffer from. So then, you know, that so we're always evaluating that, and then I suppose to take the threat a little bit further, if I do poorly in that meeting, maybe I'm not going to be part of the group, but then I'm not going to be able to provide for my family. I'm going to get laid
Right.
off now, and all of those things. And I think
Right.
now, so Laurence, I wanted to talk to you about, it's a good jumping off point to the fact that, you know, we use the word reaction a lot, stress reactions, or like habits are reactions, but how can we move from reacting to stress or having a stress reaction to a stress response where maybe, you know, the amygdala is going to do what the amygdala does, right? It's going to hijack all day long. That's its job. And I appreciate it because it stops me from getting hit by a bus when I walk across the street. I appreciate that. But in modern society, we're seeing obviously the physical threats are less than they were. But so how do we move from a spot of reacting to stress, just using our default wiring? And how do we short circuit that so that we can actually take control of our emotions and not let it, you know, have this cascading effect of poor decisions and bad communication and lack of connection, because under stress, you know, it becomes about me. So you know, what are some thoughts around how we can actually tangibly short circuit, you know, our stress reaction and move to a response?
So my first response to that is to go and become a Zen monk and live in a cave.
Right.
But I'm only being half serious or half joking, because what you have to do is practice in your day-to-day life, your non-emergency life, what you want to have happen when you're challenged under stress. And so you don't invent new behaviors in an emergency. When there's an emergency, you're going to do what you've done before, and it's going to reveal to you what you've been practicing all your life. And so there's a chapter in Deep Survival, for example, called We're All Gonna Fucking Die.
Mhm.
And in this chapter, there's a boatload of people doing a routine yacht delivery. The boat sinks in a hurricane and they wind up in a small dinghy. And two of them are screaming, basically, we're all going to die. And two of them are trying to think, like, what do we do now? We don't have any supplies. We don't even have any water. How are we going to make this come out okay. And I say in the book, if this were a movie, the two guys who were screaming were all going to die, you would immediately know those are the two who are going to die
Right.
because we're familiar. The one who's calm is the one who's going to survive. And so you have to begin examining your life. Part of situational awareness, which I call, mindfulness, is examining your own life for the ingredients you're going to get in an emergency. So how do you respond in a traffic jam? How do you respond when you stub your toe? How do you respond when things aren't going your way? You look at the stock market, it's just crashed. Your 401k is in the toilet. What do you do? I mean, are you going
And
to
I
pound the
think that
wall?
ultimately victors and victims, right? So
Yeah,
I see it in my own life, and in those that have the life is happening to me will be the two screaming we're going to die, and the others are saying, what is this trying to teach me?
right.
Life is happening for me are probably what I'm hearing you say would have a higher likelihood of dealing with stress a little bit more effectively.
Right. And psychologists call this locus of control.
Hmm.
The ones who are screaming, we're all going to die, think things are happening to them in the world. That's the way they view the world. They have an external locus of control. Those who have an internal locus of control are saying, this is an impossible situation, it seems to me. However, I have some ideas about how I'm going to deal with it. And I think it may be an opportunity for me to learn something too. So I'm going to take the steps that I know how to take and see if I can get myself out of this. And it's two very different ways of looking at the world. We're all familiar with the person I call a whiner, who is constantly complaining that things are happening to him or her, and that's not a good survival stance.
And so then that's more of a systemic, like kind of a macro view of it. So now let's take it into the moment, and just to set this up a bit. So my coping strategy is stopping, consciously stopping, and realizing, okay, relax. You're overwhelmed right now, or you're having feelings of stress. Key point: I'm not stressed out. I'm actually having feelings of stress, because you talk about locus of control. To me, I can actually now control those feelings versus this being stressed out. But that's a conversation for another episode, probably. But what I do is I take 2 deep breaths, and and there's physiology and neurology around that. So what are some specific strategies or tactics that you would suggest to somebody? They're about to walk into the boardroom, or they are going to that burning building, or whatever that might be. So with your expertise, what does that look like?
Well, breathing is well known for its efficacy in this way. And so learning to calm yourself by breathing, whatever the circumstances, is a good thing. Um, and we should all have that in reserve for times of serious stress, but it's going to come to you only if you do it, you know, before you're in an emergency. Um, and certainly having this attitude in general in your life that you can control your environment and that you can learn from your environment, and that adversity equals opportunity. This is another important concept. Something bad happens, hey, like the stock market crashed whenever it was in March. And I looked and I thought, wow, this is like bargain basement time. Let's buy some stocks. And then it came back pretty quickly, not all the way, but things to see the world. I mean, bad things are happening in the world all the time, and to see them as opportunities changes your way of viewing them. In the case of getting beyond uh, immediate stress and learning to master it, it's just practice. It's practice, 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 and that includes. I was talking to my 17-year-old son the other day, and he said, "You never yell." And I said, "Yeah, I never yell." And I said, "I wasn't always that way, but I learned that yelling doesn't really help. And especially when it comes to children, it's even worse than just not helping. It's destructive." And so when the kids were little and somebody'd spill milk at the dinner table, I wouldn't get angry. I would say, oh, you know what? Everybody spills milk when they're little kids, and it just happens, and you'll eventually figure out how not to do that. Here's some paper towels, let's clean it up. Um, Whereas I can remember seeing scenes where somebody spills milk and the parent starts yelling, and it's like, that's not a good way to learn to be calm. And so all of the little details, and this again is mindfulness, uh, all of the little details in our life are there to teach us these very important lessons that later will become important in an emergency.
And that's, well, first of all, the word mindfulness, if you were to say that 10 or 15 years ago, literally they'd be like, did you just come out of that cave? Zen, monk, like the word mindfulness, like that's, so
Yeah.
let me guess, Laurence, before this, you were doing hot yoga or whatever, right? But I'm really glad that you said that, because I think that's been practiced for thousands of years. And so I just wanted to really, unpack that. But now, that also leads me to the ultimately, from a leadership perspective, there's things that we can control and can't control, and we teach these a lot in leadership programs, and there's danger and opportunity, but also the impact that a leader has on the team and the group dynamics, whether it be the family unit or the unit on the fireground or your corporate team. It's important for people to be aware that leaders have a direct impact on how their teams interact, and the amount of stress and the emotion and reason balance that's met. So can you speak to that? Because to your point, the yacht people and plane crashes and all those, you're talking about group dynamics that really supersede the individual's ability. That just adds another layer of complexity that you have to navigate. And as a leader, I think that's really, really important. So can you speak to the impact that a leader has on the dynamic of the team? Because in my opinion, it's pretty direct.
Yes, it is. And it goes to what I was saying about yelling at children. Um, you elicit, as a leader, you have power, first of all, that's important. And to an extent, people who are working for you are your subordinates. And so the same dynamics that I talked about with the puppy and the big dog apply. And so the big dog has an ability to, when the puppy rolls over and says, okay, you're the big dog, I'm the puppy, I'm going to cooperate, that's an opportunity to play. And if the big dog is a good dog, it will simply start running around, and the puppy will chase it, and then they'll chase each other, they'll nip at each other, and they will constantly be doing a behavior that's like glancing back. The big dog will glance back to see if the puppy's there. The puppy will glance back to see if the big dog's there. And they're signaling each other that this is not combat, this is play. And all mammals do this. Reptiles don't play, mammals play. So if you go in the pet shop, you'll see in the reptile area, what do you see? Nothing. They're holding still. That's the freezing response. You go in the mammal area, you'll see the gerbils tumbling around together and the kittens and all that. So that's what we do. And a leader has to recruit that instinct to the good of the group. So if a leader is being a jerk to you, if a leader is wallowing in power and trying to frighten you and put all these negative emotions into you, you will respond with all these negative emotions. And not only will it decrease your efficiency and effectiveness in the world, but it'll make you hate his guts. And the outcome's not going to be good. So, I mean, there's no great secret to the wisdom that honey attracts more, bees than vinegar. Um, and so this is a simple formula for getting people to do what you need done in your corporate setting is be nice, be fun, be interesting, be empathetic, be all those things that the two dogs are when they play.
And I think we spoke off camera about this, where you, as a leader, you have to ask yourself, is your team being compliant or are they being committed? And that's
Right.
just, as we said, a grand canyon of difference. And so what I heard you say then is, if you want a committed group, treat them like people, respect them. And it's important also to recognize that as leaders, we actually set the tone. So we have to respect first. We have to be
Yes.
vulnerable first. We have to be empathetic first, be compassionate first. And
Right.
I think, you alluded to it, where unfortunately the bully, the intimidating leader, one, that's the mental model that has been created probably in their environment, whether it be, at home, and then it's reinforced at work and whatnot. But the challenge is that gets results though, Laurence. Like we said,
Mhm.
I tell people, and they jump up and they get shit done. So I get results. And I'm not here to be liked, Laurence, right? I don't need to be liked. I don't need to be their friend. I need to tell them to do things. But it's important to recognize that you're actually putting people under stress. Would that be accurate?
Yes, you're putting people under stress. You're making them less efficient, and there are models of this, of course, in military situation maybe, or a factory assembly line where you demand a certain performance from people. But underneath that, there's another layer, which is, are you are you being mistreated, and therefore are you more likely to do something that will screw things up? Not even on purpose, but I mean, and so I always say in corporate settings, I say your ratio of listening to talking should be pretty high, because what does someone want, especially someone who's a subordinate? You want to be heard, you want to be known, you want to be seen. It's part of our group instinct. In fact, in groups of apes, um, the leader is the guy who gets the most glances from other apes. And I don't mean that's the cause of leadership, but in terms of making eye contact, the leader is the one who is looked at the most. They're constantly checking the leader to see you know, what's the status, how does he feel, what am I supposed to do, blah blah blah. Um, and this is a very important thing. So if the leader looks at you and says, "Hey, I'd really like to know what you think," this is a huge thing. This is a great thing. And then if he actually listens to what you have to say. So there are many techniques for making this happen without, having a pizza party every day. Um, you have to be attuned to people. And frankly, some leaders are not capable of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting because you can tell that it's a square peg in a round hole because they've been told to do that. Hey, you need to listen to your team. You need to give them feedback, and again, it's sometimes like monkeys looking at a wristwatch. Where I know the industry, to your IKEA point, there are some people that can put that stuff together pretty quick. Even though they do have the instructions, but there are some that's just kind of intuitive. And I think that when you talk about engaging and having a committed workforce and committed team, that oftentimes is kind of, there's a lot of nuances around that
Yeah.
we have to recognize. And something also that I'm taking out of this, Laurence, is I have to go to the off leash area and start paying more attention. I have to go to the zoo and watch apes. Man, I'm exhausted. I got to go on a yacht and just be on a small dinghy before I learn all this. So I got a lot of work I got to do. So we're gonna have to cut this shorter, man. Oh man. And actually, and just to wrap up, Laurence, and oh my goodness, we could talk for so much, and then I'll turn it over for some questions. But I wanted to ask you, with all of your body of work, all of the time and commitment you put in, like, why do you give a shit about this, Laurence? Like, why does it matter? Because you could have just wrote a couple books, kind of, maybe do a few blog posts and so on and so forth. But by everyone that I've spoken to, you are so giving and so gracious and humble. Why does this matter?
I think it again starts with my father. My father was almost killed in the war, and he told me once, he had his wing shot off, and the plane started spinning. It was upside down and spinning and broke apart, and so he had a good long time to think about his own death, because his wing was shot off at 27,000 feet, and and so he fell 27,000 feet without a parachute and survived it. This is in deep survival. I tell this story,
Mm-hmm.
but I had asked him, and again, I was a kid. I don't remember how old, 10 or 11 maybe. What were you thinking, as you went down? And he told me about, being sad and thinking of that he'd never see his mother again, and that he and my mother were engaged, not yet married, and that he'd never see her again, and things like that. And then he woke on the ground. He passed out at some point. Woke on the ground alive, And he said he was like giddy with glee that he was alive, that like he was euphoric. Part of that may have been shock, of course, but I think he came back to life with an attitude of like, I'm going to help people. I'm going to do good things. And he became a college professor. He was very popular. I remember watching him when I was just, I don't know, 8 or 9. I went to one of his big lecture classes and he got up on the podium and said, fellow students. And after the lecture, I said, Dad, why did you say fellow students? You're the
Mhm.
professor. He was like, no, I'm a student. I mean, we should be students all our lives. And so he taught me this way of looking like enjoy your life and do something good for people because there's plenty of evil to go around in the world. And so if you can just I'm 72 now, right? And I can look at my life and say, well, I guess I'm not Hitler. You know, I'm doing something right, I hope.
Yeah,
and
I
and so
can
it's
tell
giving
you.
back.
Right, and it's a acts of service, right? And ultimately, and I
Right,
try to raise my son this way, where if we give more into society than we take away, I think ultimately the world will be a better place. And whatever that giving
right.
into society is, everyone has their zone of genius. And I really want to thank you for continuing to act, you know, portray acts of service and really walking the walk of what humbleness looks like, because I've known a lot of people with a fraction of what you know that are always the smartest people in the room. So I really appreciate you taking the time here, Laurence.
You're welcome.
And I think that if that's okay, we can turn it over to some
Sure.
questions.
Yeah,
Man,
of
I'm
course.
like, my palms are sweaty. And okay, so also too, do not drive and tie your shoelaces, and don't fall out of an airplane. There are so many pieces of wisdom here, Lawrence.
Right.
All right, so let's see here. I'll just transition off here. Okay, so we have, so first of all, Mark, good to see you. Chris Pooley. So great question. Let's see if I can show this. All right. So, Laurence, I'll read the question off. How do you develop training to help people deal with stress? What types of characteristics need to be in place for this to be effective?
So I think people need to practice in non-lethal situations, in situations where the stakes are not tremendously high, but there is stress. And the way you choose these situations is almost limitless. I mean, I played. I've been a journalist all my life. I've been a writer all my life, and I used to do magazine journalism. And one time, my editor said, "Let's do a series on cities." Where you go and you kind of get the soul of a particular city, and we do a series. And I said, great, that sounds like fun. And one of the cities was Las Vegas, and it was at a time when Las Vegas was being remade. And I said, well, if I'm going to go to Las Vegas, you have to give me some money to gamble with, because I'm not going to gamble with my own money. He said, okay, here's $500. So I went to Las Vegas, and and the game that I played was craps. I studied it. I read books on it. I learned how to play it, and I played it, and I was like afraid to lose my $500. I was under so much stress, like I'm going to lose. And what do people say when you come back from Las Vegas?
And it
Did
wasn't
you
even your
win?
money, right? Like it wasn't
Wasn't
even
my
yours,
money.
right?
And I was thinking, well, I've got to learn to manage the stress. So over a period of, I think I was there about a week, I, I learned to manage my stress just by both letting myself lose a little, winning it back, and thinking about, this is just an exercise. It doesn't mean anything. So I mean, you're not going to take everybody to Las Vegas. Well, maybe you will take everybody to Las Vegas if you're in the right kind of corporation, but you can devise things to teach people. For example, I know corporations that will take people on a hike in the wilderness, a mountaineering expedition on a not too difficult route, um, and things like that stress you and make you learn how to cope with it. So it's a creative effort to come up with ways to do this, but people do it all the time.
And I think so. There's a few things that we teach. Again, hats off to Mark Smith, who has a question coming up here. But a lot of things as facilitators, there's a tendency for us to create scar tissue learning, and we think that's effective, right? Like throw everything and the kitchen sink plus the neighbor's sink, and we'll see what this person's made out of. But so one of the things that we recommend is learning the technical skill first, kind of like driving a car, right? Like if you don't know the mechanics of driving a car, that's stressful in itself. And now
Yeah.
once you've mastered that, then we can start to layer on, okay, pedestrian comes out, or you
Yeah.
blow a tire or something like that. So I think the concept of stress inoculation is really speaking to what you just said, and being deliberate about that. So would you agree stress inoculation is a big part of it?
Yeah. Well, as a pilot for most of my life, I learned a lot of this through the process of being a student pilot first of all, and then going through the different ratings that you get as you progress in your training. And it really is very much like that, because I don't know about everybody else, but flying scared me to death. I mean, I knew my dad was a pilot, and look where it got him. And but I knew that it was important for me to become a pilot. So I mean, I was scared of it, but I had a good instructor, and he started me off slowly, and we gradually got to know what the limits were, and I wound up inoculating myself against stress and becoming an aerobatics pilot. I flew aerobatics for about 8 years, which I thought was kind of the ultimate, and enjoying it, not being stressed while I was doing it, which surprised me. I mean, given where I started off, I mean, I started off really scared of it, and I wound up just perfectly relaxed and flying upside down.
So essentially what you're doing is kind of going back to the beginning of this conversation, is you're recreating mental models, right? Where first an airplane was a mental model that how does this thing even fly, to now
Mhm.
kind of morphing that, and through deliberate practice and perfect practice, changing that
Yeah.
mental model, changing your behavioral scripts, etc. That would be accurate.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and all these things can be learned, and you can learn to overcome most of your impulsive behaviors too.
Again, that's a whole different conversation now. But I have a great question. So first of all, Chris Pooley, I just want to do a shout out to my fellow. He is a Canada Task Force 2 member. He is one of our GIS experts. So when he deploys, he puts on a tinfoil hat and a propeller on top, but tremendously valuable anyways. So, all right. So Mark has a couple of them. So Mark Smith is one of the owners of a company called Mission Centered Solutions, who does a whole bunch of work around human factors and leadership for all sorts of first response agencies all over the world, and they're a U.S. partner. So this is my Yoda as far as human factors goes. Which of your own personal deep survival experiences was a big teacher for you? So which of your own personal deep survival experiences was a big teacher for you?
Um, I can think of a few, but I'll tell you about one in particular. I got lost in Glacier National Park, and I was only lost briefly, but it was a terrifying experience, and it was a real teaching experience, learning experience. So I had been hiking with a friend in Glacier, and we were doing these very long, very strenuous hikes, 17 miles a day, 20 miles a day, and not camping out, but returning to a lodge in the park that's called Many Glacier Lodge. Um, and we had done, I don't know, maybe 5 days of that really hard hiking, seeing some beautiful stuff, and we prepared for these hikes. We took everything we needed, and including being able to stay overnight if we had to. So we had big packs, maps, everything was mapped out. We knew exactly where we were going. And then on the sixth day or something, we decided to take a day off and just loaf because we were pretty sore. And after breakfast, we looked around and there was a sign for a nature trail. We said, well, let's just go walk the nature trail today. And so we didn't take anything. I was in jeans and a t-shirt. We each had a little dime store poncho in our back pocket. And we walked this nature trail a couple miles, um, got to a lake, which was the end of the trail, and then looked, very pretty scene, and it started to rain. and we're going, oh no, it's starting to rain. We got to get back. And so we got our ponchos out and put them on. And then it started to sleet. And we started to run. And we ran back the way we'd come. And we got to a fork in the road. And she went one way and I went the other.
Mm.
It's like, wait a minute. Where did we come from? And neither one of us knew. And so we were like in a bit of a panic, frankly. And this was early on in my outdoor career. I hadn't yet learned, like, when you come to a fork in the road, you turn around and look behind you so you can see where you came from. Anyway, we started running again, which was a stupid thing to do. And now it's sleeting all around us. And we crashed through a barrier of trees, and we're at another lake, and there's a boat pulling up just as we crashed through these trees. And we're like, eh. And they came and they picked us up, and we got inside. And there was a 2-day ice storm after that. It didn't let up for 2 days. And so if we had not chanced upon that boat, it would have been, bad. And it taught me a lot. It taught me, I was a journalist being paid by National Geographic to do this stuff. So it's like, of course, I'm immune. Nothing can happen to me. I'm on assignment.
Yeah.
And actually, that incident led to my writing Deep Survival, because I went to my editor and I said, we glamorize this stuff, but we probably ought to tell people, hey, kids, this can be dangerous. And eventually I started writing about that.
And we speak a lot about that with regard to the dreaded complacency, right? Like, and that's the other side of stress we haven't talked about, and in future episode we will. But we actually need stress. We need a certain level of stress to perform at our peak. And I think that, like, if you're going out for a 10-mile one way or 20-mile both way hike, that you need all your stuff with you, and you're prepared mentally, physically, emotionally, and all that. And that gives you that edge to pay attention. But if you're not under stress, it's just a nature walk, right? And man, if I had a dime for every person that we found in search and rescue that was just out for a minute, and
Great.
really, really important. And so, and from a leadership perspective, it's our job as leaders to resist the complacency bug. Like, it's our job to actually insert some urgency, or without being panicked, right? Like, because you don't want to be that guy. But that's really interesting. And man, I couldn't even imagine what's going through your mind, especially when you're fairly young, right? You're invincible, right? That's that hazardous attitude of, I'm invincible, it can't happen to me. But man, okay, well, that's very, very interesting.
Well, and I had this attitude that I now advise people strongly against when they say, well, we've always done it this way before and nothing happened.
Right.
This is the Mount Hood scenario, but it's also the COVID virus scenario. It's like, well, I'm going to get my hair cut and my nails done and stop at the coffee shop and hang out with some friends. But I mean, I've done it like 12 times since this started, so I must be okay.
Yeah, right. That's actually a very, very good example. All right, so we have another one from Mark. Oh, okay. So, all right. What is the relationship between that initial situational denial you spoke of and the fight, flight, and freeze stress reaction? So, what is the relationship between that initial situational denial you spoke of and the fight, flight, freeze stress reaction? And that's from Mark Smith.
Well, so denial is a protective response. It means you do not have to have the fight, flight, freeze response. You're saying this isn't happening, and therefore I don't have to respond. Well, that's a very dangerous situation to be in. I mean, you need, as you pointed out, we need stress to function. You need that stress response. You don't need to panic. You just need to heighten your ability to function. And I've told this story many times, so people who may be seeing this podcast and have seen other podcasts where I'm there would have heard this before, but I think it's a very important story. It's a lesson from a guy I interviewed. He didn't end up in the book. His name is Vitos Askunas, and he was in Grand Teton going on a solo cross-country skiing outing meant to be, a day long. He would be back home at night. 5 miles out, he broke his leg, and he broke his leg very seriously. Just took a bad turn, and fell and twisted it and had a torsion fracture. So he knew he was done for. Nobody was going to come down that trail. It was either self-rescue or die. So he took up his pack, unloaded all his gear, put up his tent, lit his stove, made himself a hot drink, cooked himself a meal, and looked at all of his equipment and said, what do I need to get out of here, and how am I going to do it? So his first action was like the IKEA brain gets engaged. I'm now going to start thinking in a linear fashion. I'm going to get that emotion down, get that stress under control. Significantly, he did not engage in that initial moment of denial. He was like, holy crap, I broke my leg. And he immediately set about doing the right thing. And he was, among my many, many, many case studies, he's like a perfect guy in what he did. So he figured out, I need this and this and this. I'm going to scoot on my butt out of this wilderness. And I'm going to dedicate 100 moves each to something in my life that I love and that I want to get back to. So first 100 moves, my wife. Second 100 moves, my mother. Third 100 moves, and so forth. And he did it, 5 miles of doing this. Not fun, not comfortable, freezing cold, in the snow, succeeded, got to his car, turned the heater on, and he's alive. So this is the way to do it. And so you try to sort of sidestep that fight and flight and freeze response by being the kind of person who would do what Vito did. And it takes practice. It takes practice in our lives.
Wow, that's very, very powerful. And I think too, the denial, if I heard you say it correctly too, and correct me if I'm wrong, but part of the denial process is not only the, over flooding of stimuli and so on and so forth, but it's a way of avoiding the pain of those feelings, because ultimately pleasure or pain, right? That's what it's all about. And we'll avoid pain. We'll go to great lengths. We'll become chemically addicted and destroy our lives to avoid the pain associated. So would that be another way of looking at it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to say something else about Vito, that he broke his leg in the wilderness and saved his own life. But Vito's procedure, let's say, can be applied to anything. So I go and I open my garage door and I realize I've been throwing stuff in my garage for 30 years and it's filled to the rafters with junk. And I look at it and I go, oh God, I can't stand this. I can't do it. You can do it. Think of Vito, do it one piece at a time.
Well, and Joe Simpson, right? Touching the Void.
Yeah.
If anyone has not read the book Touching the Void, after you read Lawrence's plethora of books, Touching the Void, because again, very much a similar strategy, and that prevents that sense of overwhelm, right? One piece at a time, or maybe it's getting to the next light pole when you're on a marathon or whatever that looks like, but breaking it down. That's and I think then that also speaks to locus of control, correct? Like what you're doing is you're taking control back and saying, I control my movement over the next 100 meters, let's say. That's something I can do. So I'm sure that plays a factor as well.
Yeah, that's what happened with Joe. He said, I broke my leg. I'm at 20,000 feet on a Peruvian mountain in the snow. I'm obviously going to die, but I think I can make it over to that rock over there, and I think I'll do that first. That's, he got off the mountain.
And again, not to go too much into detail on that story because it's a complicated one, but if anybody could have said life happened to me, if anybody could have sat in the crevasse or any multitude of situations where he ended up being as a victim, that was the individual, because knowing how he ended up there and all those things. And even to this day, my understanding is, they've agreed to disagree, but it's ultimately the law of the mountains, right? And man, my blood, like I start to get stressed out about that alone. So we have, one more. So, from Lionel Crowther. All right. So,
Lionel.
who is an absolute amazing individual. So it's all right. Hi, Laurence. Great webinar. Yeah, and I set this up, Lionel, just so we're clear. All right. No, I'm just kidding, Lionel. I'm at the lake, so only able to watch via iPhone and can't ask questions. So can you and Daryl discuss VUCA and if you've heard of fight, flight, freeze, and blend? Interesting. So VUCA, I'm not familiar with what that acronym is. Do you know that one, Laurence?
No, I don't.
Okay, so if Joanna, on behalf of Lionel, if you can add, what that is. But so, Laurence, have you heard of fight, flight, freeze, or blend?
Haven't heard of blend.
Interesting. Okay, well, it looks like
But
Lionel's ahead of
maybe
both of
talking
us on
about
that one.
blending the response between two different responses. Blend the two.
Okay, so Lionel actually, yeah, so he just sent me a text, but no, it's the same question, so I'm not sure. So what VUCA is, Laurence? I'm not sure. Oh, Mark Smith. Okay, yeah. So it is volatile, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark.
Well,
Right.
those certainly all go against our natural inclination to want predictability. So one of the things that the whole perceptual system I talked about earlier of how we perceive things and how we register them and make models of them is aimed at making our world predictable so that we can move through it efficiently and survive. And when something unpredictable comes out, in fact, the whole sensory system is tuned to novelty. So you go to the store and you buy a nice picture and you hang it on your wall and you think, gosh, that's a really nice picture. After about a week, you won't even see it. You'll forget it's there because it's your sensory system has incorporated it as a pay no mind item in your environment. It can't feed you and it can't kill you, so ignore it. And so we want predictability, and those things that you just mentioned are anti-predictability.
That's very interesting. And you also spoke about really reticular activation, whereby the subconscious is already taking in that room as you walk into it. It's doing a complete cataloging, inventorying of,
Yeah.
will it feed me or eat me? And
Yeah.
it's important to recognize that if we don't see a picture where it used to be, it's not like it's a conscious thing where you're looking in, but you're saying like, hold on, what's different?
Right.
Oh,
What's
the picture there. And that's long
Right.
before it reaches our cognitive brain, which I think, again, people who think that they're logical are blissfully detached from the reality, I suppose. So, all right. So great. Well, I think, Laurence, that is it for the questions. So I have to run to the dog leash park and go to the zoo and book an airplane parachuting. I got a list of stuff I got to do and write a bunch of
Okay.
books. Oh my
Sounds
gosh.
good.
So we will conclude the live session here, Laurence, and you and I will meet on the other side. But again, I really wanted to honor you for your commitment to public safety and helping others navigate the complexity of stress and survival and this emotion and reason balance. And I think that ultimately, if we could all be more mindful, the world would be a much calmer, more peaceful place. So, Laurence, thank you for doing your part.
I'm going back to my cave now.
Sounds good. All right.